Thank you for joining us today, and welcome to BuzzBack's latest webinar, Identifying Communication Gaps Between Patients and HCPs. During the presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode. However, you may submit questions at any time today by typing them through the chat feature, located to the left of your screen. Or if you're in full screen mode, look for it in the top of your screen. We'll be fielding questions at the end of the presentation. As a reminder, today's call is being recorded and will be offered at the conclusion of today's event. I would like to take this time to introduce you to Jonathan Weiser, Senior Director of Healthcare Research at BuzzBack. Jonathan has over 10 years of research experience in the healthcare arena, ranging from academic public health research to supplier-side research, working directly with the pharmaceutical, medical device, consumer health, and health plan industries. After joining BuzzBack in the spring of 2015, he jumped right in and developed BuzzBack's patient journey methodology. Jonathan is also an adjunct professor in the communications set at Manhattan College. Jonathan, take it away.
Great. Thanks so much, Melanie, and thank you all for taking the time to meet with us this morning. So as Melanie mentioned, we are going to talk today about some of our recent communication gaps research. And what we did, we focused on COPD because we know that this is a highly prevalent condition across the world. So you see here that about 6% of the US population, 2% in the UK, over 5% of China. So if you were to do the math, you can understand this is a lot of people that this affects across the world, and it's also a chronic condition. So when someone is diagnosed with COPD, this is going to be something that they're going to be living with throughout the world, or throughout their life. And it's also estimated that as of 2020, that the inhaler industry alone for COPD and asthma will be about $34 billion. So as you can see from a business perspective, there's certainly a lot of opportunity in this area. We focused on patient-physician dialogue because we know, so picture yourself, you walk into your physician's office, and you have probably about 20 minutes, about the length of this webinar, to interact with your physician. So what happens during this time? So imagine that you were just diagnosed with a condition. So you're going to hear information about your diagnosis. You're going to get information about treatment recommendations, possibly even about medication. We know that there's a lot that goes on during this time period, but it's hard to really understand what is going on and what is resonating with patients. Lots of research has been done in the past to really link that this effective physician-patient communication can lead to better adherence. So we wanted to understand and do this research to specifically figure out where some of these disconnects so that companies like yourself, whether it's pharmaceutical companies or consumer health, can help try to figure out how to fill some of these gaps. We partnered with the respiratory team at AstraZeneca, which is why we focused on COPD patients, to really, as I mentioned before, figure out what resonates, what doesn't resonate, and how different companies and different stakeholders can help fill these gaps. We know that imagery plays an important role in educating patients. We feel the same way in terms of how we interact with our respondents. So whether they're online as part of an exercise, we like to incorporate a lot of visual exercises to try to get and elicit stronger emotional impact. This just gives you a little bit of an overview of some of the different techniques that we at BuzzBack use. So certain things like collaging, where we use visuals, imagery as catalysts to really get some of those underlying emotional components, and that's something that we'll talk about a little bit today. We work with a lot of large and small pharmaceutical companies, a lot of big consumer health companies. We're a preferred supplier at many, many different pharmaceutical companies, and we have really developed these techniques to not only get very in-depth and emotional-based feedback for respondents, but also make the process more engaging and get them to come back and continue to take our online instruments. So I'm going to walk you through a little bit of a case study of our research. As Melanie mentioned, there'll be a little bit of time at the end for questions, so by all means, feel free to ask questions. We'll address them at the end. So as I mentioned before, we reached out to both COPD patients and physicians. So we went out to PCPs and pulmonologists. We talked a bit about their experience or their history with COPD, and then focused a bit about what was going on prior to diagnosis, at diagnosis, and sort of post-diagnosis when they are continuing and going through ongoing treatment, medication, et cetera. So we focused a bit around the communication around the medication. The key business questions here was really to understand a bit about what is the relationship like between COPD patients and the HCPs who treat them, and most importantly, to really identify gaps and disconnects that occur between these patients prior to diagnosis, at diagnosis, and for ongoing care, with the ultimate goal here of trying to figure out if there are some of these gaps that exist, how can other stakeholders, so let's say it's pharmaceutical, consumer health, et cetera, help to fill some of these gaps that may exist, so ultimately patients their needs can be most met and ultimately leading to higher adherence. So we're going to focus a little bit first on the relationship between HCPs and patients. So as we see here, the average number of visits per year is about 4 to 5 times in about, let's say, 20 minutes. So picture that around 80 to 100 minutes a year that physicians and patients are going to spend together. And this is pretty uniform, and we've seen this through other research as well. And what we also want to understand is who people are relying on to manage their COPD. So we see here that it's a mix between PCPs and pulmonologists, but as you'll see here, it's actually more likely that the primary care provider is actually their go-to HCP rather than a pulmonologist. So we actually see pulmonologists are just 1 in 4 see a pulmonologist as their go-to HCP. So we start to get the sense that, right off the bat, that it could be that some of these specialists are being underutilized. We wanted to also understand a bit more about, as I mentioned before, about what this relationship looks like. So this is looking at what % feel that they have strong relationships with HCPs, so that's 65% of patients, and then what % of physicians feel that they have strong relationships with their HCPs, and that's where we get about 90% of physicians. So right off the bat here, you start to understand or start to see that physicians may indeed be overestimating a little bit their relationship with some of these patients. We wanted to understand, in particular from a physician perspective, or from a patient perspective, how do they feel about their relationship with their HCPs? So we're going to walk you through a little bit of our collaging technique. We do this in a lot of cases. We do it to assess how people feel about brands or conditions. And in this case, we focused a little bit more on the relationship. And what we'll do is we'll just kind of show you a quick demo here. And this shows here that respondents go in and they select a variety of images, and they really use these images as catalysts to try to describe what their experience is like, how they feel about it. And we've done a lot of research that compares, if they were to do something like this versus just kind of more standard answering of questions, that you get a lot more richer data. So what we saw here, as I mentioned, when we looked at their interaction or their experience with their healthcare providers, is that patients are mostly positive, so they feel their HCP cares and listens, they're happy with their treatment, but there are some concerns. So there are patients who feel a little bit rushed, that their HCP doesn't care about them and they may not be as helpful as they would like. This here just gives a little bit of an example of how they feel about their COPD, so just sort of giving a little bit of examples of what that exercise looks like. So as we mentioned before, we see that patients are mostly positive, but a little mixed with regards to how they feel about their HCP. We wanted to dig a little deeper and see how this could compare to pulmonologists and PCPs. So if you remember before, we have about 25% who are interacting directly with a pulmonologist, but most are actually interacting with a PCP. But what we see is that those who are interacting with a pulmonologist actually tend to have far more positive experiences than those who are interacting with a PCP. So things like knowledge about my COPD, which is something that you would certainly expect from a pulmonologist, but then even things like answering my questions better, and even things like treating with respect, and in particular knowledgeable about up-to-date treatments. These are all areas where pulmonologists, so according to patients, those who see pulmonologists view them more favorably than PCPs. And this is something that we've seen in a lot of other conditions as well, that there is a little bit of this dilemma with how do you handle patients who are seeing PCPs versus patients that are seeing a specialist, given that PCPs can certainly not be specialists in every area, et cetera, and then what are ultimately some strategies that can be done to address that. What's really interesting here is